The sun blazed mercilessly over Phoenix, Arizona, casting long shadows across Abuela Rosa's carefully tended backyard. At 3 years old, Emma Rodriguez was a whirlwind of energy wrapped in a tiny package, her dark curls bouncing as she crouched beside her grandmother's prized rose garden. Her small fingers delicately shaped wet sand into what she proudly declared were princess castles, complete with moats filled with water from the garden hose. "Myra, Mommy," Emma called out in her mixture of English and Spanish, holding up a lopsided sand creation toward her mother. "Es un castillo for the fairy princess." Maria Rodriguez looked up from the picnic table where she was arranging paper plates for the family barbecue, her heart swelling with the familiar warmth that only her daughter's infectious joy could bring. "It's beautiful, mi amor," she called back, snapping a quick photo with her phone. The image would later become one of the last pictures taken of Emma before everything changed forever. The Rodriguez family had gathered at Abuela Rosa's house for their monthly Sunday barbecue, a tradition that had continued for over 15 years. The small backyard buzzed with conversation in both English and Spanish as cousins chased each other around the desert landscaping. Uncles debated soccer scores over cerveza, and the women shared the latest neighborhood gossip while keeping watchful eyes on the children. Emma's father, Carlos, stood at the smoking grill, his weathered hands expertly flipping carne asada, while telling animated stories to his brother-in-law about his construction job downtown. His booming laugh periodically rose above the family chatter, and every few minutes, his eyes would automatically scan the yard to locate his precious daughter, a habit all parents develop without conscious thought. "Emma, stay where we can." "See you, Mia," Maria called out as she noticed her daughter had wandered closer to the back gate that led to the desert, preserved beyond the neighborhood. The child waved acknowledgement, but continued her exploration, drawn by a bright yellow butterfly that danced tantalizingly just out of reach. Abuela Rosa, despite her 73 years, moved with surprising agility as she carried a steaming pot of her famous refried beans to the serving table. "That child has the curiosity of a cat," she observed to Maria, her voice carrying the wisdom of having raised 6 children and helped care for countless grandchildren. Just like her father at that age, always exploring, always getting into mischief. The butterfly that had captured Emma's attention was a western tiger swallowtail, its wings creating mesmerizing patterns as it fluttered from the blooming desert willow to the prickly pear cactus near the property line. To Emma's 3-year-old mind, it was pure magic, a flying piece of sunshine that surely must be seeking the same fairy princess who would live in her sand castle. Butterfly. Pretty butterfly. Emma giggled, abandoning her sand creations to follow the delicate creature. Her tiny legs carried her with surprising speed across the yard, past the mesquite tree where teenage cousin Miguel was texting on his phone, past the outdoor fire pit where Tio Roberto was setting up speakers for music. The adults continued their conversations, the familiar sounds of family gathering creating a soundtrack of safety and normalcy. Children's laughter mixed with the sizzle of meat on the grill, the clink of ice in glasses, and the gentle strumming of cousin Sophia's guitar. It was the kind of perfect family moment that forms the foundation of childhood memories. But perfection, as every parent knows, can shatter in an instant. The butterfly led Emma toward the back corner of the property, where Abuela Rosa's chain link fence separated the manicured yard from the wild desert beyond. Desert preserve land stretched for miles in every direction, a beautiful but dangerous expanse of saguaro cacti, rocky washes, and wildlife that included everything from roadrunners to rattlesnakes. Emma reached the fence and pressed her small face against the cool metal, watching as the butterfly sailed effortlessly through the links and continued its journey into the untamed landscape beyond. The child's fingers found a spot where the fence had been damaged during last summer's monsoon storms, a section where the chain link had pulled away from the support post, just enough to create a gap, barely large enough for a determined 3-year-old. "Emma, come eat, baby." Maria's voice carried across the yard as she began filling plates with food. When she didn't see her daughter's immediate response, a familiar flutter of maternal concern touched her chest. "Emma, where are you, sweetheart?" Carlos looked up from the grill, his experienced father's instincts immediately alert. He could see most of the yard from his position, but Emma's small form was nowhere visible among the desert landscaping and outdoor furniture. "Emma," he called, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that usually brought instant compliance from his daughter. Silence. The family's cheerful conversations began to falter as more adults joined in calling Emma's name. Miguel looked up from his phone. Sofia stopped mid-strum on her guitar, and Abuela Rosa's weathered hands paused in their task of arranging napkins. "She was just right here by the roses," Maria said, her voice tight with the first threads of panic as she hurried toward Emma's abandoned sand castles. The tiny pink sneakers sat neatly beside the garden, as if Emma had simply stepped out of them and vanished into thin air. Carlos dropped his grilling tongs and began a systematic search of every corner of the small yard, behind bushes, under the picnic table, in the outdoor storage shed. His movements became increasingly frantic, as each potential hiding spot revealed nothing but empty space. "Emma, this isn't funny anymore, Mia. Come out now." Maria's voice cracked with rising fear as she searched inside the house, checking every closet, every room, every possible place a small child might hide during a game of hide-and-seek gone too far. But deep in her mother's heart, Maria already knew the terrible truth that she wasn't ready to face. Emma wasn't hiding. Emma was gone. The butterfly continued its lazy flight across the desert preserve, unaware that it had led a curious little girl into a nightmare that would change multiple lives forever. And in the distance, barely visible through the gap in the damaged fence, tiny footprints in the desert sand told the story of a 3-year-old's last adventure in her grandmother's backyard. The sound of Maria's scream would haunt the neighborhood for years to come. Maria's piercing scream shattered the peaceful Sunday afternoon like a gunshot, instantly transforming the jovial family gathering into a scene of controlled chaos. Within seconds, every adult in Abuela Rosa's backyard was on their feet, abandoning plates of half-eaten carne asada and rushing toward the sound of a mother's worst nightmare made real. "Dios mío, ¿dónde está Emma?" Abuela Rosa's weathered hands trembled as she clutched her rosary, her 73 years of life experience unable to prepare her for this moment. The elderly woman had raised 6 children in this very neighborhood, and had never lost track of a single one, not even for a moment. Carlos Rodriguez's construction-hardened frame moved with surprising speed as he vaulted over the picnic table, his work boots pounding against the desert landscaped ground. His dark eyes, usually warm and laughing, now held a wild desperation that his family had never witnessed before. "She can't have gone far," he said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Emma, ven acá, Mia." The family spread out across the small property like a well-coordinated search team, each person taking responsibility for different areas. Tio Roberto checked the storage shed again, this time moving every tool and garden supply. Cousin Sofia searched under every bush and behind every piece of outdoor furniture while teenage. Miguel scaled the mesquite tree to get a better vantage point of the surrounding area. "I found something." Maria's voice carried a mixture of hope and dread as she knelt beside the damaged section of fence, where Emma's tiny footprints were clearly visible in the soft desert sand. The gap in the chain link, barely 18 inches wide, looked impossibly small for a person to squeeze through, unless that person was a determined 3-year-old following a butterfly. Carlos dropped to his knees beside his wife, his calloused fingers tracing the outline of his daughter's shoe print in the sand. Beyond the fence, more tiny tracks led into the vast expanse of Sonoran Desert that stretched endlessly toward the distant mountains. The preserve was over 50,000 acres of untamed wilderness, home to javelinas, coyotes, mountain lions, and countless species of venomous snakes and spiders. Call 911 now. His voice carried an authority born of absolute fear. Within 8 minutes of Maria's frantic phone call, the first Phoenix Police Patrol unit arrived, followed quickly by 2 more. The officers, experienced in missing child cases, immediately began establishing a perimeter and gathering crucial information. Officer Janet Liu, a 15-year veteran with the department's specialized missing persons unit, took charge of the scene with calm efficiency. "How long has Emma been missing?" Officer Liu asked, her pen poised over her notepad as she absorbed every detail Maria and Carlos provided. 20 minutes, maybe 25, Maria replied, her voice shaking. She was playing right there by the roses, and then her words dissolved into tears as the reality of the situation hit her with renewed force. The radio crackled with urgent communications as additional resources were dispatched to the scene. Detective Sarah Chun, the department's top missing persons investigator, was en route along with the K-9 unit. A helicopter was being prepped for aerial reconnaissance, and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office was coordinating with state park rangers who knew the desert preserve intimately. As the family waited in agonizing silence, neighbors began arriving. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community, and soon dozens of people were gathered in Abuela Rosa's small backyard. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought her powerful flashlights, while the Morales family from across the street arrived with bottled water and energy bars, supplies they knew the searchers would need as the day wore on. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors began echoing across the desert as the police aviation unit launched their aircraft, equipped with thermal imaging cameras. From their aerial perspective, the vastness of the search area became starkly apparent. The desert stretched in every direction, broken by rocky washes, dense clusters of saguaro cacti, and treacherous terrain that could easily hide a small child or claim her life. Detective Chun arrived 45 minutes after the initial 911 call. Her unmarked sedan followed closely by a specialized K-9 transport vehicle. The detective was a small woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that came from successfully solving over 200 missing persons cases in her 12-year career. Behind her emerged Officer Martinez and his partner, a massive German shepherd named Rex. Rex was no ordinary police dog. The 5-year-old shepherd had been trained at the highest levels of search and rescue work, capable of tracking human scent across miles of difficult terrain, even hours after a trail had gone cold. His black and tan coat gleamed in the desert sun as he stood alertly beside his handler, every muscle in his powerful frame radiating controlled energy and focus. "I need something with Emma's scent," Officer Martinez said, his voice calm and professional despite the urgency of the situation. "Clothing she's worn recently, a favorite toy, anything that will give Rex a clear scent signature to follow." Maria rushed into the house and returned with Emma's beloved stuffed bunny, a pink and white toy that had shared Emma's bed every night for over a year. She pressed the toy against her face for a moment, breathing in the faint scent of her daughter's shampoo that still clung to the fabric. Rex's powerful nose immediately locked onto the scent, his tail wagging slightly as he processed the olfactory information. Officer Martinez gave the command, and the magnificent dog began working methodically around the backyard, his nose sweeping back and forth as he sorted through the complex mixture of smells. Family members, food, desert vegetation, and finally, the distinct scent signature of one small girl. The moment Rex caught Emma's trail leading toward the damaged fence, his entire demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward, his pace quickened, and a low whine of excitement escaped his throat. This was what he had been trained for, what his every instinct drove him to do: find the lost and bring them home. "He's got her," Officer Martinez announced, his voice carrying the first note of hope anyone had felt since Maria's scream. "Rex has Emma's scent, and it's leading into the preserve." As the sun began its relentless descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, the search for Emma Rodriguez began in earnest. Time was running out faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. In the Sonoran Desert, darkness brought predators, freezing temperatures, and 1,000 ways for a small child to simply vanish forever. But Rex was on the trail, and somewhere in that vast wilderness, a 3-year-old girl was waiting to be found. The Sonoran Desert at night transformed into a different world entirely, one where shadows concealed deadly threats, and every sound carried the potential for both hope and horror. 26 hours had passed since Emma Rodriguez had vanished. Through the gap in her grandmother's fence, and the massive search operation had evolved into a desperate race against time, biology, and the unforgiving desert environment. Rex's powerful frame moved with methodical precision through the moonlit landscape, his black nose never lifting from the ground as he followed Emma's increasingly faint scent trail. Officer Martinez stayed close behind, his flashlight beam dancing. Across the treacherous terrain of loose rocks, hidden arroyos, and spine-covered cacti that could easily trip an exhausted searcher. The German Shepherd had been working almost continuously, stopping only for brief water breaks and moments of rest that barely qualified as such. "Easy, Rex," Martinez whispered, as his partner suddenly paused at the edge of what appeared to be solid ground covered in desert brush and scattered rocks. The dog's ears pricked forward with laser focus, his powerful chest rising and falling with controlled breathing as he processed scents invisible to human perception. Behind them, the search team had grown to over 200 volunteers, professional rescue workers, and law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies. Powerful searchlights cut through the darkness like modern lighthouses, creating an otherworldly scene as teams methodically combed every square foot of the desert preserve. The helicopter continued its aerial reconnaissance, the thermal imaging, cameras searching for the tiny heat signature of a 3-year-old child in a landscape that seemed designed to swallow people whole. At the command post established in Abuela Rosa's backyard, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez sat in folding chairs provided by the Red Cross, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Neither had slept, eaten, or moved more than a few feet from the radio that crackled with constant updates from the search teams. Dark circles shadowed their eyes, and Maria's voice had gone hoarse from calling Emma's name during the early hours of the search. "Any word from the K9 unit?" Carlos asked Detective Chun for the 10th time that hour. His voice carried the desperate edge of a father who was watching his world crumble with each passing minute. "Rex is still on the trail," Detective Chun replied, though her experienced eyes couldn't hide the concern she felt. After 26 hours in the desert, the chances of finding Emma alive were dropping dramatically. Dehydration, exposure, wildlife encounters. The variables were stacking against them with each tick of the clock. Dr. Patricia Simmons from Phoenix Children's Hospital stood nearby, her medical bag ready and a pediatric transport team on standby. Just minutes away, the emergency room physician had seen too many cases like this, and she knew that if Emma was found alive, every second of medical response time would be critical. Severe dehydration in a child Emma's age could cause organ failure, brain damage, or death within hours. Miles away in the desert preserve, Rex suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His muscular body went rigid, every sense focusing on something ahead that only he could detect. Officer Martinez had worked with Rex for 3 years and knew every nuance of his partner's behavior. This wasn't the excited alertness of following a scent trail. This was the focused intensity of a discovery. "What is it, boy?" Martinez whispered, his pulse quickening as Rex began a low, rumbling whine that seemed to come from deep in his chest. The dog's tail remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on a patch of ground that looked identical to the hundreds of other patches they had investigated throughout the night. Rex moved forward with careful precision, his paws avoiding loose rocks as he approached what appeared to be nothing more than desert brush and scattered stones. But as Martinez followed, his flashlight beam revealed something that made his heart race. The vegetation wasn't natural. Someone or something had deliberately arranged the branches and rocks to conceal what lay beneath. "Command, this is K-9 unit." Martinez spoke into his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Rex has alerted on something significant. Requesting backup and medical support to my location immediately." The radio crackled with urgent responses as multiple search teams began converging on Martinez's coordinates. In the distance, the helicopters. Rotors grew louder as the aircraft changed course to provide aerial support and lighting for whatever Rex had discovered. Working carefully, Martinez began clearing away the brush and rocks that concealed what Rex's extraordinary nose had detected. Each piece of vegetation removed revealed more of what lay hidden beneath: wooden planks, old and weathered, partially collapsed into what appeared to be a void in the ground. "Oh my God," Martinez breathed as his flashlight beam penetrated the darkness below the broken planks. The light revealed a narrow mining shaft, probably dating back to the early 1900s, when prospectors had dotted the desert with holes in search of silver and copper. The shaft was barely 3 feet wide and appeared to drop straight down into the earth. Rex's whining intensified as he paced at the edge of the opening, his powerful nose detecting something that made every instinct in his body focus on the darkness below. Martinez dropped to his knees at the edge of the shaft, his flashlight beam probing as deep as its power would allow. "Emma!" He called into the depths, his voice echoing off the rocky walls. "Emma, can you hear me?" For a moment, only silence answered back. Then, faint as a whisper and more beautiful than any sound Martinez had ever heard, came a tiny voice from the darkness. "Help me." The words were barely audible, weak with dehydration and exhaustion, but they carried the power to transform despair into explosive hope. Martinez's hands shook as he keyed his radio microphone. "Command, this is K-9 unit. I've found her. Emma Rodriguez is alive, approximately 15 feet down in an abandoned mining shaft. I repeat, the child is alive and responsive. We need the technical rescue team here now." Rex sat proudly beside his handler, his tail finally wagging as the voice from below called out again, stronger this time. "I want my mommy." The desert night suddenly filled with the sounds of hope, radio chatter, approaching vehicles, and in the distance, the sound of a mother's prayers being answered. Rex had done what he was born to do, what he had been trained for, what his every instinct demanded. He had found Emma Rodriguez, and she was alive. The real rescue was just beginning, but for the first time in 26 agonizing hours, the word miracle seemed entirely appropriate. In the depths of an abandoned mine shaft, a 3-year-old girl was about to discover that sometimes heroes come on 4 legs and have cold, wet noses. The sterile corridors of Phoenix Children's Hospital buzzed with activity as Emma Rodriguez was wheeled through the emergency department doors, her tiny form dwarfed by the adult-sized gurney and the team of medical professionals surrounding her. Dr. Patricia Simmons had seen countless pediatric emergencies during her 15-year career, but the sight of this particular 3-year-old, dehydrated, scratched and trembling, struck her with unusual force. Temperature 103.2, blood pressure dropping, signs of severe dehydration. Called out the paramedic who had rappelled down the mine shaft to perform the delicate extraction. She's been conscious and responsive during transport, asking for her parents repeatedly. Emma's dark eyes, though clouded with exhaustion and fever, tracked the unfamiliar faces surrounding her with the wariness of a child who had experienced something beyond her young comprehension. Her lips were cracked and pale, her normally vibrant curls matted with dirt and desert debris. Most concerning to Dr. Simmons were the unusual scratches along Emma's arms and legs, not the random scrapes one would expect from a fall, but marks that seemed almost deliberate. In the family waiting area, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez sat in plastic chairs that might as well have been torture devices, their bodies rigid with exhaustion and anxiety that wouldn't ease until they could hold their daughter again. Detective Sarah Chun occupied the chair beside them, her notepad filled with preliminary questions that would soon become the foundation of a much larger investigation. "I need to ask some difficult questions," Detective Chun said gently, her voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who had delivered both good news and devastating news to countless families. "Emma's survival is miraculous, but there are aspects of this case that don't add up to a simple accident." Carlos looked up from his hands, his bloodshot eyes focusing on the detective with difficulty. "What do you mean?" "She followed a butterfly and fell into that hole. Rex found her. Case closed, right?" Detective Chun opened her notepad, revealing pages of meticulous handwriting and sketch diagrams. "The mine shaft Emma was found in is located 1.7 miles from your grandmother's backyard. It's in an area that requires climbing over several rocky outcroppings and navigating through dense desert vegetation. The path isn't something a 3-year-old could manage alone, especially while following a butterfly." The implications of Chun's words settled over Emma's parents like a cold shadow. Maria's hand instinctively went to her throat as she struggled to process what the detective was suggesting. "Are you saying someone took her there?" "I'm saying we need to investigate all possibilities," Chun replied carefully. The mining shaft was deliberately concealed with fresh brush and rocks. Someone knew it was there and took steps to hide it. Whether that someone was trying to hide Emma or hide the dangerous hole itself, we need to determine. Dr. Amanda Foster, the hospital's chief pediatric psychologist, emerged from Emma's room carrying a preliminary assessment that would soon become crucial evidence. At 43, Dr. Foster had specialized in trauma counseling for children, developing innovative techniques for interviewing young victims without causing additional psychological harm. "Emma is stable medically," Dr. Foster reported, "but she's exhibiting classic signs of traumatic stress. She keeps asking about the dark man and mentions being carried by big hands. She also repeatedly asks about a nice doggy, presumably Rex, and seems to associate him with safety and rescue." Detective Chun's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. The mention of a dark man and big hands suggested adult involvement, transforming what might have been a tragic accident into a potential kidnapping case. "Has she provided any other details about this person?" "She drew a picture," Dr. Foster said, producing a piece of paper covered in a 3-year-old's crayon artwork. The drawing showed stick figures, a small one presumably representing Emma, and a much larger, darker figure looming nearby. Child psychologists have learned to read significant meaning into young children's artwork, especially when created so soon after traumatic events. The drawing sent a chill through everyone who examined it. A large figure was rendered entirely in black crayon, with Emma's small form appearing to be held or carried by oversized hands. In the corner of the paper, drawn in bright yellow, was what appeared to be a dog, Rex, the hero who had saved her life. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Forensics experts were conducting a meticulous examination of the area around the mine shaft. Crime scene investigator Marcus Webb, ironically sharing a name with the man who would later be wrongfully accused, photographed every inch of the concealed opening and the surrounding desert terrain. "We've got adult footprints," Webb announced to the team, his camera flash illuminating the soft sand around the shaft's entrance. Size 11 or 12 boot print, probably steel-toed work boots based on the heel pattern. These prints are less than 48 hours old, and they don't match any of our rescue team members. The footprint evidence was photographed from multiple angles, measured precisely, and cast in dental stone to preserve the impression. More disturbing was the discovery that the footprints approached the mine shaft from the same direction Emma would have come, then circled the area several times before, heading back toward the neighborhood. Detective Chun received the forensics update via radio while still at the hospital. The physical evidence was beginning to paint a picture that made her stomach clench with professional dread. Someone had been at that mine shaft recently, someone who had deliberately concealed it, and someone whose presence coincided with Emma's disappearance. "We need to expand this investigation immediately," Chun told her supervisor over the phone. "This isn't a lost child case anymore. We're looking at possible kidnapping, child endangerment, and potentially attempted murder. Someone put that little girl in that hole and left her there to die." The hospital's security cameras were already being reviewed, and every staff member who had contact with Emma was being carefully interviewed. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team was being notified, transforming the local missing persons case into a federal investigation with resources that spanned multiple states. Emma's medical examination revealed additional troubling details. Along with the dehydration and exposure, she had what appeared to be ligature marks on her wrists, faint but unmistakable signs that she had been restrained at some point during her ordeal. Dr. Simmons documented every mark, every scratch, every indication that Emma's 26 hours in the desert had involved far more than simply being lost. As the sun set over Phoenix on Emma's second day in the hospital, the investigation had transformed completely. What began as a search and rescue operation had become a hunt for someone who had deliberately put a 3-year-old child in mortal danger. The evidence was mounting, the resources were mobilizing, and somewhere in the sprawling metropolitan area, a predator who thought he had committed the perfect crime was about to discover that leaving Emma alive had been his biggest mistake. The only witness to his crime was a brave little girl who would soon find the courage to speak 2 words that would change everything. But first, investigators had to find him, and Emma had to find her voice again. 3 weeks after Emma Rodriguez's miraculous rescue from the abandoned mine shaft, the investigation had taken on a life of its own, sprawling across multiple law enforcement agencies and generating leads that stretched from Phoenix to the Mexican border. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez had been assigned to lead the federal task force, her 20-year career in crimes against children making her uniquely qualified to navigate the complex psychological landscape of the case. Dr. Amanda Foster's sessions with Emma had become the cornerstone of the investigation, conducted in a specially designed interview room at Phoenix Children's Hospital that looked more like a comfortable playroom than an interrogation facility. Soft lighting, colorful toys, and child-sized furniture created an environment where a traumatized 3-year-old might feel safe enough to reveal the secrets locked in her young mind. "Can you tell me about the dark man again, Emma?" Dr. Foster asked gently, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who understood that children's memories operated differently than adults. She sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor, maintaining Emma's eye level while the little girl arranged plastic animals in elaborate scenarios. Emma's small hands paused in their play, her dark eyes growing distant as she accessed memories that clearly caused her distress. "He had scary eyes," she whispered, placing a toy elephant protectively in front of a smaller animal. Like when Poppy gets mad, but worse. Much worse. Dr. Foster made careful notes, aware that every word Emma spoke would be scrutinized by investigators, attorneys, and eventually a jury. The child's descriptions had remained remarkably consistent over multiple sessions. The dark man with big, scary hands who had carried her to the dark place and left her there, with promises that someone would come get her soon. The most disturbing revelation had come during Emma's fourth session, when she had spontaneously begun drawing what she called the game the scary man wanted to play. The resulting artwork had sent chills through everyone who saw it. Stick figures engaged in activities that no 3-year-old should understand, much less experience. Dr. Foster had immediately contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, specialists in criminal psychology who could interpret the subtle indicators embedded in a child's artistic expression. Special Agent Martinez reviewed the growing case file in her Phoenix field office, surrounded by crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and psychological assessments that painted an increasingly dark picture of Emma's ordeal. The physical evidence alone was damning. Adult footprints at the mine shaft, ligature marks on Emma's wrists, and trace DNA evidence found on her clothing that didn't match anyone in the Rodriguez family. "We've got a sophisticated predator," Agent Martinez explained to Detective Chun during their daily briefing. Someone who planned this carefully, knew the desert terrain, and had advanced knowledge of the Rodriguez family's routines. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a calculated abduction with intent to sexually assault a child. The geographical profile developed by FBI analysts had narrowed the suspect pool to someone with intimate knowledge of the desert preserve, possibly a park ranger, geologist, or mining historian who would know about the abandoned shaft sites. The perpetrator also had to be someone with access to the Rodriguez family's schedule, suggesting a connection to their neighborhood or social circle. Dr. Foster's most recent session with Emma had yielded the breakthrough investigators had been hoping for. Using play therapy techniques, she had encouraged Emma to act out her memories using dolls and a dollhouse. The 3-year-old had carefully placed a large male doll in a vehicle, then moved a smaller female doll from a backyard setting into the car. The scary man said he knew where the princess lived. Emma had explained in her matter-of-fact way that children use when describing the incomprehensible. He said he wanted to show me a special place where princesses go to hide, but it wasn't pretty. It was dark and scary, and I couldn't get out. The detail that had electrified the investigative team was Emma's description of the vehicle. A big white truck with pictures on the side. When Dr. Foster had asked about the pictures, Emma had drawn recognizable images of trees and mountains, suggesting a commercial landscaping or Park Service vehicle. Agent Martinez immediately cross-referenced the description with the employee records of every organization with legitimate access to the Desert Preserve. The list included the Arizona State Parks Department, several landscaping companies that maintained the visitor areas, and a handful of environmental consulting firms that conducted research in the preserve. One name appeared on multiple lists: Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old geological surveyor who worked as an independent contractor for various government and private agencies. Webb's work required extensive knowledge of historical mining operations, explaining his familiarity with abandoned shaft locations. More troubling was his criminal history: 2 previous arrests for child endangerment in California. Both cases plea bargained down to lesser charges due to insufficient evidence. The surveillance team assigned to Webb reported disturbing behavior patterns. He lived alone in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of Phoenix, surrounded by detailed maps of the Desert Preserve and what appeared to be surveillance photographs of local playgrounds and schools. His work truck, a white Ford F-150 with environmental consulting logos on the doors, matched Emma's description perfectly. Webb's employment records showed he had been conducting soil surveys in the neighborhood adjacent to the Rodriguez family during the week preceding Emma's disappearance. The work would have given him opportunity to observe the family's routines, particularly their Sunday gatherings at Abuela Rosa's house. Dr. Foster's latest breakthrough had come when Emma spontaneously mentioned that the scary man smelled like dirt and chemicals and had maps all over his truck. The specificity of these details, combined with her consistent descriptions over multiple sessions, provided the probable cause investigators needed to obtain search warrants. The psychological profile developed by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit painted a picture of a sophisticated predator who targeted young children in isolated settings. The perpetrator demonstrated extensive planning, geographical knowledge, and a disturbing patience in selecting and stalking his victims. Most chilling was the assessment that Emma's survival suggested she had been intended as a long-term captive rather than a murder victim, the mine shaft serving as a temporary prison, while the perpetrator prepared a more permanent location. As the task force prepared to execute search warrants on Webb's property and vehicles, Emma continued her recovery at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Her physical injuries were healing, but the psychological trauma ran deeper than anyone initially understood. She refused to go outside without a trusted adult, insisted on sleeping with multiple lights on, and had developed an intense attachment to a stuffed German shepherd that reminded her of Rex, her canine rescuer. The investigation was approaching its climax, with enough evidence to arrest Marcus Webb and charge him with kidnapping, child endangerment, and attempted sexual assault of a minor. What nobody, not the FBI, not Detective Chun, not even Dr. Foster, suspected was that they were about to arrest an innocent man, and that the truth lay buried in the confused memories of a 3-year-old girl who was still too traumatized to separate reality from the nightmares that haunted her dreams. The real revelation would come months later, in a courtroom where Emma's simple words would shatter everything they thought they knew about her ordeal in the desert. The Maricopa County Superior Courthouse had never seen media attention quite like the circus surrounding the state of Arizona v. Marcus Webb. News vans lined Jefferson Street for 3 blocks in each direction, their satellite dishes reaching toward the desert sky like technological prayer wheels seeking justice for a 3-year-old girl. Court TV had secured exclusive broadcasting rights, while national news anchors delivered their morning reports from the courthouse steps, each one promising viewers unprecedented access to what prosecutors were calling the most disturbing child endangerment case in Arizona history. Inside courtroom 4A, the atmosphere crackled with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her early 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during her 20-year tenure on the bench. But even her extensive experience hadn't prepared her for the emotional powder keg that was the Marcus Webb trial. The prosecution table was commanded by District Attorney David Walsh, a man whose political ambitions were as well known as his 94% conviction rate. At 52, Walsh had built his career on high-profile cases that generated the kind of publicity that launched attorneys into governors' mansions and Senate seats. The Emma Rodriguez case represented everything Walsh loved about criminal prosecution: a sympathetic victim, compelling evidence, and a defendant who looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of a child predator. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table like a man who had already been convicted, his thin frame dwarfed by the expensive suit his court-appointed attorney had insisted he wear. At 34, Webb looked older, his prematurely graying hair and deep-set dark eyes giving him the haunted appearance of someone who had spent the past 8 months in protective custody, away from the general prison population that would have killed him within days of his arrest. His attorney, Lisa Park, was a 38-year-old public defender who had volunteered for the case despite knowing it would likely destroy her career regardless of the outcome. Park had graduated magna cum laude from Arizona State University Law School, but budget constraints meant she was facing Walsh's team of 6 prosecutors with only a part-time investigator and a legal aid intern to assist her. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh began his opening statement, his voice carrying the practiced gravitas of a man who understood the power of storytelling in a courtroom. 8 months ago, 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez was playing in her grandmother's backyard when a monster in human form decided to destroy her innocence forever. That monster sits before you today. Walsh's opening was masterful theater, combining verifiable facts with emotional manipulation in a way that had the 12 jurors, 8 women and 4 men, all parents or grandparents themselves, leaning forward in their seats. He methodically laid out the evidence. Webb's presence in the neighborhood, his knowledge of the desert terrain, his criminal history in California, and most damning of all, Emma's own descriptions of her attacker that seemed to match Webb perfectly. The defendant's truck was white with environmental logos on the side, exactly as Emma described. His work gave him intimate knowledge of every abandoned mine shaft in that desert preserve. His criminal history shows a pattern of inappropriate interest in young children. And the DNA evidence found on Emma's clothing will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Marcus Webb is the man who kidnapped, terrorized, and attempted to sexually assault this innocent child. The physical evidence was indeed compelling. Webb's DNA had been found on Emma's shirt, a result he couldn't explain since he claimed never to have met the child. His work truck matched Emma's description, and his detailed maps of the desert preserve showed notations marking the exact location where Emma was found. Most damaging of all was his inability to provide an alibi for the Sunday afternoon when Emma disappeared. Lisa Park's opening statement was brief and desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus Webb is an awkward, socially isolated man who makes an easy target for a community's need for justice. But being strange is not a crime, and coincidences, no matter how suspicious they appear, are not proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." The prosecution's case is built entirely on circumstantial evidence and the confused memories of a traumatized 3-year-old child. The trial's first week was a parade of prosecution witnesses that painted an increasingly dark picture of Webb's character and opportunity. Detective Sarah Chon testified about the crime scene evidence, her professional demeanor masking the personal satisfaction she felt at seeing Webb in custody. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez walked the jury through the behavioral profile that had led investigators to Webb, explaining how his work patterns and criminal history made him the perfect suspect. Dr. Patricia Simmons from Phoenix Children's Hospital testified about Emma's physical condition when she was found, describing the ligature marks and other evidence of restraint that suggested prolonged captivity. Her testimony was clinical and devastating, particularly when she showed the jury photographs of Emma's injuries that had grown men wiping their eyes and women clutching tissues. The most anticipated testimony came from Dr. Amanda Foster, whose gentle demeanor and obvious expertise in child psychology gave her words tremendous credibility with the jury. She described Emma's play therapy sessions, the disturbing artwork, and the consistent descriptions of a dark man with scary hands who had taken her to the bad place. Emma's memories of the trauma are remarkably consistent, Dr. Foster testified. Children this age typically cannot fabricate complex narratives involving sexual themes they haven't been exposed to. The details she provided could only come from direct experience. When Walsh played video recordings of Emma's therapy sessions for the jury, several members turned away from the screen. The little girl's matter-of-fact descriptions of being carried by the scary man and left in the dark place were heartbreaking in their innocence and devastating in their implications. Lisa Park's cross-examination of the prosecution witnesses was skillful, but ultimately ineffective against the mountain of evidence Walsh had assembled. She highlighted the lack of direct physical evidence linking Webb to the actual abduction, pointed out inconsistencies in the timeline, and questioned whether Emma's memories might have been influenced by well-meaning but leading questions from investigators. But Park's biggest challenge wasn't the evidence. It was her client. Marcus Webb was a terrible witness in his own defense, his nervous mannerisms and inability to make eye contact with the jury, making him appear guilty even when telling the truth. His explanation for how his DNA ended up on Emma's clothing was particularly unconvincing. "I sometimes helped elderly residents in that neighborhood with yard work," Webb testified, his voice barely audible even with the courtroom microphone. "I must have handled their laundry that was hanging outside to dry. That's the only way I can explain it." As the trial entered its third week, with Emma's own testimony looming on the horizon, the courtroom had become a pressure cooker of emotion, evidence, and expectation. Media coverage had turned Webb into the most hated man in Arizona, while Emma had become a symbol of childhood innocence destroyed by adult evil. What nobody in that courtroom realized was that they were about to witness a moment that would shatter everything they thought they knew about justice, truth, and the power of a child's simple words to change the world. Judge Patricia Williams. Chambers had been transformed into something resembling a child-friendly therapy room, rather than the typical austere judicial setting. Soft lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence. Colorful toys were scattered across. A Persian rug and the intimidating judicial bench had been replaced with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. The morning of Emma Rodriguez's testimony had arrived, and everyone involved understood that the next hour would determine whether Marcus Webb spent the rest of his life in prison or walked free. Emma, now 4 years old and noticeably taller, and during her rescue 8 months earlier, entered the chamber clinging tightly to her mother's hand. She wore a bright yellow dress that Maria had chosen specifically because it was Emma's favorite color, the color of sunshine and butterflies, innocent things from before the nightmare began. Her dark curls had grown back thick and lustrous, but her eyes still held the wariness of a child who had learned too young that the world contained monsters. Dr. Amanda Foster positioned herself near Emma with the practiced ease of someone who had conducted hundreds of these delicate interviews. District Attorney Walsh sat rigidly in his chair, his political future hanging on every word that might emerge from the small child's lips. Defense Attorney Lisa Park appeared resigned yet desperately hopeful, knowing this was likely her only chance to save her client from a life sentence. The most unexpected presence in the room was Rex, the German shepherd who had found Emma in the mine shaft. Officer Martinez had suggested bringing the dog as a comfort animal, a decision Judge Williams had approved despite Walsh's objections. Rex lay quietly in the corner, his intelligent brown eyes watching Emma with the patient attention that made him exceptional at his job. "Hello, Emma," Dr. Foster said gently, settling into her chair at the child's eye level. "Do you remember me? We've talked before about your adventure in the desert." Emma nodded solemnly, her small fingers twisting the hem of her yellow dress. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I remember. You have the pretty toys, and you asked me about the scary things." For 25 agonizing minutes, the adults in the room attempted to coax testimony from Emma that might clarify the events of that terrible day. Dr. Foster used every technique in her considerable arsenal: play therapy, gentle questioning, art supplies, even role-playing with dolls. But Emma remained largely silent, offering only monosyllabic answers that shed no new light on her ordeal. Walsh's frustration was palpable. His entire case hinged on Emma's testimony corroborating the evidence against Webb, but the child seemed more interested in the crayons than in identifying her attacker. Park, meanwhile, felt a growing sense of hope that perhaps Emma's silence would create reasonable doubt about Webb's guilt. "Emma," Dr. Foster tried once more, "can you tell us about the man who took you to the dark place? The man with the big hands?" Emma's response was to retreat further into her chair, pulling her knees up to her chest in a defensive posture that broke her mother's heart. Maria Rodriguez sat in painful silence, torn between wanting justice for her daughter's trauma and protecting Emma from having to relive it in front of strangers. Judge Williams was preparing to call a recess when something extraordinary happened. Emma's attention suddenly shifted from the adults surrounding her to the large dog lying quietly in the corner. Her demeanor changed completely. The wariness evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like joy. "Doggy," Emma whispered, her face lighting up with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in months. Rex, with the uncanny ability that made him exceptional at search and rescue work, seemed to sense Emma's attention. He lifted his massive head and looked directly at her, his tail giving a gentle wag that somehow conveyed both recognition and reassurance. Emma slipped down from her chair with the fluid grace that only small children possess, walking across the room toward Rex with growing confidence. The adults watched in stunned silence as the traumatized little girl, who had been unable to speak about her ordeal, approached the dog who had saved her life. She knelt beside Rex, her small hands reaching out to touch his soft fur with the reverence reserved for something sacred. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, allowing Emma to pet his head and scratch behind his ears. Then, in a voice clear enough for everyone in the chamber to hear, Emma spoke two words that would echo through the courthouse like thunderclaps. "Thank you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every adult in the room felt the earth shift beneath their feet as the implications of Emma's simple words crashed over them like a tsunami of realization. She wasn't identifying her attacker. She was thanking her rescuer. "Thank you, doggy," Emma repeated, wrapping her tiny arms around Rex's neck in a hug that conveyed more gratitude than any adult speech could ever express. "Thank you for finding me in the dark place. Thank you for bringing the nice people to get me out." Dr. Foster's professional composure cracked as tears streamed down her face. 8 months of therapy sessions, hundreds of hours analyzing Emma's drawings and play patterns, countless attempts to understand her fragmented memories of trauma, and the truth had been hiding in plain sight. Emma remembered Rex. She remembered being rescued, not being attacked. Walsh's face had gone ashen as he realized what Emma's words meant for his case. If Emma was thanking Rex for rescuing her, then her memories of being carried by big hands might refer to being carried to safety by rescue workers, not being abducted by Marcus Webb. Her descriptions of the dark man could be confused memories of the mine shaft itself, the darkness that had surrounded her during her terrifying ordeal. Lisa Park felt her heart racing as hope flooded through her for the first time since taking Webb's case. Emma's spontaneous recognition of and gratitude toward Rex suggested that her memories had been fundamentally misinterpreted. The child wasn't identifying her attacker. She was thanking her hero. Judge Williams called an immediate recess, her experienced judicial mind racing through the implications of what they had just witnessed. Emma's simple "thank you" to Rex had potentially shattered the entire prosecution case, revealing the possibility that a traumatized child's confused memories had been misinterpreted by well-meaning adults desperate for justice. As Emma continued to hug Rex, telling him about the butterflies she had been chasing and how scared she had been in the dark place, the adults in the room began to grapple with a terrifying possibility. They might be about to convict an innocent man based on the confused memories of a 3-year-old who had been found, not captured, by the very dog she was now thanking. The truth, as Emma's innocent words were beginning to reveal, was simpler and more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. Sometimes the monsters we're hunting exist only in our own desperate need to find someone to blame for life's random cruelties. The emergency session of the state of Arizona v. Marcus Webb resumed 2 hours after Emma's stunning revelation, but the atmosphere in courtroom 4A had fundamentally changed. Where once sat a community hungry for justice against a child predator, now sat a collection of individuals grappling with the horrifying possibility that they had been spectators to a massive miscarriage of justice. Judge Patricia Williams had spent the recess in intense consultation with both legal teams, child psychologists, and her own conscience as she wrestled with how to proceed. Dr. Amanda Foster had used the break to conduct the most important interview of her career with Emma, this time approaching the child's memories from an entirely different angle. Armed with new understanding, she gently guided Emma through her recollections without the assumption that she had been abducted. What emerged was a heartbreakingly simple story that explained everything while simultaneously destroying 8 months of investigation and prosecution. The butterfly was so pretty, Emma explained to Dr. Foster, her small hands moving expressively as she spoke with the enthusiasm that only children can muster when discussing something that captivated them. It was yellow like sunshine, and it was dancing in Abula's flowers. I wanted to show it my princess castle, but it flew away through the fence. The gap in Abula Rosa's fence, damaged during the previous summer's monsoon storms, had been large enough for a determined 3-year-old to squeeze through in pursuit of a western tiger swallowtail butterfly. Emma's description of following the butterfly deeper into the desert preserve painted a picture of childhood curiosity rather than criminal abduction. I tried to follow the butterfly friend, but there were so many rocks and poke plants, Emma continued, unconsciously rubbing her arms where the cactus spines had scratched her during her solo desert adventure. Then the ground went away and I fell into the dark place. I was so scared, and I called for Mommy and Poppy, but nobody could hear me. The dark place that had featured so prominently in Emma's previous descriptions wasn't a location where she had been taken by an attacker. It was the abandoned mine shaft where she had accidentally fallen while chasing the butterfly. Her descriptions of being carried by big hands weren't memories of abduction, but rather confused recollections of being lifted to safety by the rescue workers who had rappelled down to extract her. Dr. Foster's re-interview revealed that Emma's memories of the scary man with dark eyes were actually fragmented recollections of the mine shaft itself, the darkness surrounding her, the fear and the disorientation that had lasted for over 26 hours. A 3-year-old's mind, traumatized and desperate to make sense of a terrifying experience, had anthropomorphized the darkness into a human figure. Marcus Webb, meanwhile, sat in the defendant's chair experiencing emotions he couldn't have imagined. Existed. 8 months of imprisonment, death threats, legal fees that had bankrupted him, and the complete destruction of his reputation were beginning to feel like a nightmare from which he might actually awaken. His court-appointed attorney, Lisa Park, was frantically taking notes as she prepared to present the new evidence that could exonerate her client. District Attorney David Walsh faced the most devastating moment of his political career as he was forced to acknowledge that his ironclad case had been built on a foundation of misunderstood child trauma. The DNA evidence that had seemed so damning now had innocent explanations. Webb's work in the neighborhood had indeed brought him into contact with laundry hanging on clotheslines, exactly as he had testified. "Your Honor," Walsh said, his voice carrying none of the prosecutorial confidence that had characterized the previous 3 weeks of trial. In light of new evidence that has come to light, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Marcus Webb with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in a chaos of voices as media representatives, family members, and observers struggled to process the dramatic reversal. Emma's parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, sat in stunned silence as they realized that their daughter's trauma had been real, but their understanding of its cause had been tragically wrong. Judge Williams gavelled for order, her experienced voice cutting through the din. "Mr. Webb, please stand." Marcus Webb rose on unsteady legs, hardly daring to hope that his 8-month nightmare was about to end. "Sir, the charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The court wishes to express its regret for the ordeal you have endured, and you are free to go." The explosion of camera flashes and shouted questions from reporters created a surreal backdrop as Webb collapsed back into his chair, overcome by relief and the crushing realization of how close he had come to spending his life in prison for a crime that had never occurred. But the most important moment came when Emma, still clutching a small stuffed German shepherd that reminded her of Rex, approached the defense table with her parents. Looking up at Marcus Webb with the unfiltered honesty that only children possess, she said simply, "I'm sorry you got in trouble because I got lost." Webb knelt down to Emma's eye level, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're trying to help." The aftermath of Emma's revelation sent shockwaves through the Arizona legal system and beyond. The Rodriguez family issued a public apology to Marcus Webb, offering to help him rebuild his life and career. A legal defense fund established by guilty community members raised over $200,000 to help Webb recover from his ordeal. Rex, the German shepherd whose nose had saved Emma's life and whose presence had ultimately saved Webb's freedom, received a commendation from the Phoenix Police Department and became something of a local hero. Emma maintained a special relationship with her canine rescuer, visiting him regularly and always greeting him with the same 2 words that had changed everything: "Thank you." Dr. Amanda Foster used the case to develop new protocols for interviewing traumatized children, ensuring that future investigations would be less likely to misinterpret a child's confused memories. Her research paper, The Emma Rodriguez Case: Lessons in Pediatric Trauma Testimony, became required reading in law enforcement and child psychology programs nationwide. The abandoned mine shaft where Emma had spent those terrifying 26 hours was permanently sealed and marked with a memorial plaque dedicated to the importance of truth, justice, and the courage it takes to admit when we're wrong. Emma, now 5 years old and thriving, visits the memorial occasionally with her parents, laying flowers and thanking the desert for teaching everyone such an important lesson. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the most innocent voices, spoken in the simplest words that possess the power to change everything. Emma's story became a reminder that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about truth. And sometimes the truth is more beautiful and more tragic than any story we could ever imagine.